So by way of introduction, this is Ms. Ashley V. Anthony. And Ms. Anthony will be talking to us today about the practices of British medicine during the period of Indian indentureship in Guyana and the process of colonization. So over to you, Ms. Ashley. You can introduce yourself and say anything you want to say about yourself before starting your presentation. Over to you.
Okay, great. My name is Ashley Anthony. I am a current student at Yale University, and the work that I am presenting here, I wrote for my thesis for my undergraduate major in the history of science and medicine. And so it's going to talk, the main goal of the thesis really was to look at medicine as a whole and think about the ways in which medicine is affected by social structure, and also to then take a look historically to see how medicine might have played a role in the process of colonization. And I chose to focus on Guyana because I'm Guyanese, and I was just interested in exploring this area of history. And so I'm going to take you guys through some of the things that I discovered in writing that paper. And I found really that one of the places where you saw the most evidence for medicine playing a role in colonization was really in mental health. And so I thought that was interesting, and I'm going to walk you through one of the ways in which that happened. So can I share my screen?
Yes, we can see the poster.
Okay, great. Excellent. Right. So one of the things about mental health is I feel like it gets talked a lot about in different contexts as it relates to society. I feel like it's one of the areas of health where it's more clear to see the relationship between what society defines as healthy and what gets considered unhealthy or constructed as illness. And so there has been a lot of work in mental health and deconstructing why certain things get termed as illnesses. So I relied a lot on that kind of analysis. So particularly I looked at Foucault and his discussions about madness, insanity, and asylum dynamics. And I also looked a lot at Fanon and how he talked about mental health in a colonized state, and the ways in which really when you exist in a colonized state, the doctor does not seem very different from a policeman. And so putting those kinds of ideas together, I really wanted to talk about mental health in the context of the Caribbean and India, and kind of try to see if there were any parallels that I could find. And one of the ones that I found was to do with marijuana use. And so marijuana use, it has this it's historically been used widely in India. And so a lot of Indians believe that marijuana is a religious herb. And so Hindus, particularly those who worship Lord Shiva, will often partake in marijuana usage on holy days. But other Hindus who don't necessarily worship just Lord Shiva will also take part in marijuana usage on special days, such as Holi or Phagua, as we would call it, or the Kumbh Mela. And initially, when the British were there in India in the 1840s, they didn't have much of an issue with marijuana, but by the 1860s, they became preoccupied with this insanity that they claimed that it caused. And so one of the major arguments of my thesis is that the British constructed behaviors which they didn't approve of to be insanity. And marijuana usage was constructed as a cause of the insanity because the British were aware that many Indians used marijuana. And so the evidence for this argument. So if we look back, some of the behaviors that were classified as insanity by the British during that period, we look at them now, we would say, okay, like that still seems like something we might say is insanity, right? So for example, one of these behaviors was something they called running amok, where they said that patients would run violently through the streets and cause harm to themselves or others. Another behavior that they classified as insanity was ritual sacrifice, or sati, where a widow at the funeral of her husband would throw herself on the pyre as an act of like devotion and love. And so they said that it was insanity to like commit suicide in that way. And we might think to ourselves, okay, these are still behaviors that harm people, harm themselves or others, and this is something that we might not see as socially acceptable. But some other things that the British classified as insanity were sexual promiscuity, seeking abortion, and even revolt against the British. So there was an instance in 1857 where there was a revolt against the British, and then the British claimed that the Indians and the people who had started this rebellion were marijuana users, and they had only done it because they had gone insane. And the British and Western medicine in general had a trend at that time of ascribing some behaviors like this, like seeking liberation as insane. And so in America at the time, there was a doctor who described a disease called drapetomania, which was a mental illness that he said slaves who tried to run away from plantations had. And so he was really trying to say that the natural state for these people to be in was slavery, and for them to want to run away, that was a mental illness. So immediately we can see, looking back at that and looking back at some of the things that the British class as insanity, we wouldn't say that. And it becomes clear how when you have a governing power that's seeking to colonize and is seeking to maintain political and social control, how medicine can become wrapped up in constructing ways to oppress the class of people that are being colonized. So further evidence that marijuana was being constructed as this cause of insanity is that there were many patients who were admitted to asylums where the cause of insanity was initially listed as unknown, and then it was later changed to marijuana usage. And in 1894, this all kind of comes to a head. And so they do this huge survey called the Indian Hemp Drug Commission survey. And it's about 7,000 pages long. They interview doctors, workers, people who own places where people are working in the fields. And they conclude that moderate drug use of marijuana was the norm. And this kind of use typically did not produce any ill effects. Yet people continue to be detained in asylums for marijuana use. And the same report also found that in 1892, 222 asylum admissions had been attributed to marijuana use, but only 98 of them could even be considered reliable. So only 98 of those 222 people that had been admitted even used marijuana. And so the question then becomes, like, why put people in asylums, right? Like, why would the British want to put these people there? And so the argument that I propose is the doctors in these asylums then used the space and used the power that they had over patients in the asylum to reform them into patients and people who they thought would fit British ideals. And so within asylums, at the time, there was a lot of emphasis placed on the physical body and not really on the mental state of patients, which would seem surprising. But really, the goal was to create this healthy body and a willing mind. So a healthy body to work and a mind that was willing to work. And so you find that a lot of the notes that were taken about patients were really concerned with how much they weighed, if they were able to do work, if they were willing to do work. And patients would be incentivized to work, and they would be offered like better food or better conditions if they did this kind of work. And the goal really was to try to create someone that was able and willing to work. And in addition to that, they also used the asylum as a space to kind of model how they thought that society should be organized. And so you had gender distribution of labor, you had segregation by race, segregation by religion. And then lastly, the asylum was also used as a space to produce knowledge about races. And so I know in Guyana, there were, at the Berbice Asylum, the doctor who ran the asylum used his patients to generate racial knowledge. So he would talk about the sizes of their skulls, and try to relate that to intelligence or like intelligence or likelihood that someone would like become insane. And so it was really like they used the asylum as a space to generate knowledge for the science of phrenology, which was just a racialized way of justifying that people should be subjugated. So they would generate this science saying that people of other races were less intelligent or less capable of emotion and feeling, with the hopes that they could then use this to justify continuing to subjugate other populations. And so when we look at the modern day effects of all of this in the Caribbean, marijuana use remains illegal for recreational use in many Caribbean countries, and in some countries it's not even authorized for medical use. And in 2018, according to CARICOM, 91% of youth between the ages of 17 to 30 responded that it was easy or very easy to get and purchase marijuana. And approximately like half of these respondents admitted to marijuana use, and with 20% of them admitting to using marijuana either once or twice per day. So we know that young people are using marijuana, yet it remains illegal for recreational use or medical use in most countries. And so laws against using marijuana in the Caribbean countries that persist really harm youth in multiple ways, because if we know youth are using the drug, and we have these harsh penalties in place, youth can be imprisoned, they can be prevented from practicing their religion. So for Hindus who worship Shiva in that very traditional way, they are not able to, as well as Rastafarians, where marijuana plays an important role in their religious practices. Youth are, and everyone as a whole, are robbed of the potential medicinal benefits of the drug. They're robbed of potential economic benefits of legalization. And so the report tried to look at some of the reasons why people opposed, legalization of marijuana. And two of these were related to the belief that the drug caused antisocial behaviors and that it was a dangerous drug, more harmful than alcohol. So the ideas that the British really tried to drill home during colonization, that marijuana was dangerous, it caused insanity, it caused antisocial behaviors, have really persisted in the Caribbean. And people still think that marijuana is this very dangerous drug that is more harmful than alcohol. So I have, like in this thesis, I talked about some of the other ways in which I think that British medicine acted as an agent of colonialism, which don't necessarily include mental illness. And I'm happy to talk about those with anyone who's interested, but this is what I have with regards to mental health. Does anyone have questions?
Thank you, Ashley. That was a very nice presentation. I think it touched on issues that we are familiar with in Guyana, and not just familiar with, but issues that we are battling with at the moment. Any questions from the audience for Ashley? Yes, there's a question.
So when you talk about the British using medicine to, like say, well, colonize in a way, East Indians in Guyana, East Indians in India, etc. Do you think that they use medicine, they use Indians to also practice or experiment in their medical practices? To try drugs out, to try the symptoms out, etc.
Sorry, I couldn't, the question was a little, I couldn't.
Are you hearing me clearly, Ashley?
Yes, I'm hearing you.
So what the question is, whether you believe that the British would have used the East Indians for experimental therapies, interventions, medications that they were trying Did they do that as part of this construct and colonization that they were doing at that time?
So in my research, I don't think I came across any of that. But I'm sure that if you did more research, if I did more research, perhaps I could find an answer to that question. What I will say is that in the things that I read in writing this, I didn't necessarily come across experimental therapies that they were trying to test out for use in like Europe, but I did come across therapies that they kind of knew weren't going to work, but they did as a means of control. So one of them, there's an instance of a man who was in an asylum in India, and he wasn't eating. And so the doctor at the time decided that as like a punishment or supposed therapy, because they were very obsessed with people having healthy physical bodies, that they would administer tea rectally. And so that obviously was not a treatment that they were hoping to use in Europe, but it is an example of them abusing their power and really creating a treatment that they knew wasn't beneficial to the person, just to kind of enhance this power dynamic that they had.
The reason I asked the question is because, for example, in Austria, in Poland, where the Nazis had over 1 million Jews in prison, literally in prison there. I remember in doing a tour, they said that the Nazi medical specialists, they were using the woman to perform experimental gynecological operations. Okay, yeah.
Right, so it's not far-fetched there to question whether they were doing the same thing with the Indians in India and in the Caribbean. And we know that they did this with the Africans as well. So they did these experimental procedures without anesthesia because they felt that these persons are subhuman and don't perceive pain the same way that they do. Right? We know they were wrong, and that they know they were wrong as well. But as part of the subjugation and the power dynamic, because they could do it, they did it. All right, as inhumane as it was. Any other question for Ashley? That was a very lovely question, by the way. No, we have shy people in the audience. I don't believe so. All right, Ashley, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. We thank you.